The Garfield movie and brimstone anger. Two things I never thought I would say in the same sentence, but in talking about the Garfield movie, kind of got to talk about the critical response of this movie, review this movie as well, and also just kind of give my thoughts about everything going on in the discourse of the Garfield movie, because as much as I'm a film critic, I am also so fascinated by the discourse in American culture and society, what that says about the larger influences in this age of social media that we live in. But today I am focusing my review on the Garfield movie, directed by Mark Dindal, which I didn't know this going into the movie. This is the same guy that did The Emperor's New Groove, one of my favorite animated comedies of all time. This is like one of my favorite movies growing up, period. It's maybe my favorite Disney movie, just straight up. He also directed Chicken Little, another movie that I saw when I was a kid. This film, the Garfield movie, has a stacked cast, and the cast is something that we got to talk about today because Mr. Public enemy number one on social media is in this movie, Chris Pratt. We'll talk about Chris Pratt a bit in this role as Garfield, the titular cat who hates Mondays. Samuel Jackson stars in this movie as Vic, which is a thing that happens in this movie. Hannah Waddingham from Ted Lasso stars as the villain of this film. Nicholas Hoult plays Jon Arbuckle. Cecily Strong, Brett Goldstein, Bowen Yang, and Snoop Dogg round out the cast with an supporting performance from Ving Rhames in this. And oh boy, we're going to talk about Ving Rhames because this movie is essentially a Mission Impossible movie starring Garfield. Two questions going into Garfield, and this is where I'll kind of just share some of my thoughts and feelings about the discourse going on, which again, I think is so infuriatingly annoying that we're going to get into today. But I have the most two straightforward questions that you could ask going into a Garfield movie. Who is the audience for a new Garfield movie? Like, just genuinely, who craves a new Garfield movie? This property came out in 1978. It is quite literally 45 years old. And it hasn't had a movie since Garfield, The Tale of Two Kitties, which came out when I was legitimately, I think, like 8 or 9. So my thought was, who really is calling for this movie? And then my second one, ignoring the first question, would I at least have fun going to see the Garfield movie? So let me give you just a brief rundown. I went yesterday on Memorial Day for my holiday to go see the Garfield movie alone at 10 a.m. It was a fairly decently populated showing. I was definitely the only one there without kids. I legitimately decided to sit in like the third row, so I was as far away from everyone else as possible because no one wants their kids sitting next to a complete stranger alone in a movie theater seeing the Garfield movie at 10 a.m. It's just true. Here is the synopsis for the Garfield movie. Voiced by Chris Pratt, Garfield follows the world-famous, Monday-hating, lasagna-loving indoor cat who lives a life of pamper until one day he and his trusted companion Odie are kidnapped and are forced to team up with Garfield's long-lost father Vic to pull off a milk heist in order for Garfield and Odie to be reunited with their loving owner Jon Arbuckle. And before we get into some real review of this movie, I think it is really important to just address the difficulties in making a Garfield movie. The difficulties of making a 100-minute feature of Garfield, I think, is actually pretty underrated. He's a cat that's defining traits are that, I wrote it down, he eats and he hates Mondays. He's been around since 1978, and when he is most popular, it is quite literally a newspaper comic strip that lasts like, less than 100 words. Even when he was maybe at his most popular, which was probably the time he was appearing in the newspaper comic strips, as well as having his own primetime specials, such as Garfield Gets Life, a primetime special that I loved as a kid. I had the DVD, came out in 1991. I probably saw it in the early 2000s. It's still 22 minutes. That's 1/5 of the runtime of this movie, the Garfield movie. So what do you do? And I'm genuinely asking this because, and this is where I'm going to get in the discourse, and this is going to sound insane that this discourse of the Garfield movie is driving me up the hill like crazy. Like, I just don't understand what we're doing here. But the fact that, like, I'm reading grown men on the internet, some of them prominent critics, by the way, essentially being like, The Garfield movie is terrible. They disrespect the source material. What is this movie? What are we doing here? It's a Garfield movie. Who gives a crap? The only question that should matter is, did like a 5-year-old go into this movie and enjoy this movie? My review legitimately means nothing next to that. Just let kids have a good time. And like, if you're genuinely complaining about the logic and sense within a Garfield movie, or saying that Garfield was so miscast and that here's these list of 20 different actors that would have done more justice to the character and stuck closer to the source material, like, get over your fandom. Like, you're a grown-ass adult. But going into this, so how do they solve this problem that I just talked about with basically making a Garfield movie the runtime? Well, they make it a Mission Impossible movie. That's quite literally what they do. It is a Mission Impossible animal parody, and they literally get Ving Rhames to play the same character, but as a cow. This movie, Garfield, despite being made by Sony, quite literally parodies so much Paramount property. Is specifically the Tom Cruise Paramount properties. There is a direct reference to Top Gun in this movie. There is a direct reference to Mission Impossible in this movie. Along with this film also just parodies Apocalypse Now, 1940s noir. Attack of the Clones is this movie that I think is parodied in this. And so it's this kind of just crazy hijinks movie. And the movie Garfield works best when it is just focusing on the relationship between Garfield, Odie, and Jon Arbuckle. And it's specifically, the movie is actually at its most impactful when we're following the character of Garfield, voiced by Chris Pratt, and the character of Vic, Garfield's long-lost father, voiced by Samuel L. Jackson. Garfield is weirdly a movie about fathers and sons, and in that I also found it a weirdly touching and poignant movie about fathers and sons, something that I wouldn't expect going into this movie. To say that I almost cried in the Garfield movie is definitely something that I wouldn't have had on my 2024 bingo card, but here's where we are. So let's go back to this original question of who is this movie made for? And while watching the movie, it becomes quite obvious very quickly. This is so clearly a kids movie made for the youngest of kids. A lot of bright colors, visual gags of food, the cuteness of Garfield and Odie, the faux peril, the constantness and rapidness of scenes. It's just so fast paced. And I think that's just to keep young kids' attention. And to be honest, I was fine with it. Did I laugh during the Garfield movie? I wouldn't say so, but there were a few scenes that legitimately made me chuckle and smile. Odie is the MVP of this movie. He legitimately has some really cute, funny scenes in this movie. There's a visual gag of him building a loft, which I thought was just really funny. There's this random roadkill joke in the movie that just, for whatever reason, actually did get me. I think it was one of the more clever, inspired jokes in this. But like I said, did it make me laugh? Not really. But did it make all the other kids in the auditorium laugh? Yeah. And did it annoy me? Like, did the jokes annoy me? No, I found them pretty innocent and sweet and lighthearted. Did it make me nostalgic for Garfield? Not really. Was it surprisingly endearing? Yeah, I legitimately had an emotional pull during this movie. And that's what works about the Garfield movie, or Garfield the movie. Above all else, Garfield is a movie about fathers and sons and what sacrifices a father is willing to make to give his son a better life. We see that prominently displayed through the Vic character played by Samuel L. Jackson, but we also see the sacrifices that Jon Arbuckle make, and Garfield coming to terms with that in a really shockingly just beautiful ending. And again, is this a pretty poignant ending? I wouldn't necessarily go that far. I would say that for this level of a movie, there is an actual emotional depth and sweetness to it. And I think it plays really well to kids, where it's just help them understand what their parents do for them and the role that they play and the sacrifices that they make to be a parent. So while watching this, again, I had the second question of, would I have fun with the Garfield movie? I found it endearing. The movie works best when it's small and interpersonal in its relationships, which to say that Garfield is a character drama or a character study is completely false, but I also did think that the movie worked best when it was smaller in these moments. So I understand some people giving the criticism of this movie that when it's a heist/action movie, it's kind of a nothing. It very much feels like a Secret Life of Pets, the bad guys. It feels like any of those types of movies, just with a Garfield aesthetic over it. But again, I find that people are just being really weird with this movie. If you're legit upset/frustrated with Chris Pratt voicing this character, then I don't know what to tell you. Here's what I think of the situation. I wish we got actual talented voice actors in these roles, and not like just someone like Chris Pratt, who's a famous voice and can, promote his fame basically to help the Garfield movie. But that is the reality. And I think Chris Pratt is a far above average voice actor. And I think he at least is able to capture stuff. I've liked Chris Pratt's vocal performances in the past. I legitimately think he's a little underrated in the Mario movie. I actually thought he worked really well. I think that whole voice cast is really good. That's a review that I know some found controversial, but whatever, you can check that out if you want to. But with that all said, I don't know how to feel if you were legitimately frustrated by Chris Pratt as a vocal actor in this, as him being a disloyal vocal actor to Garfield. Because to some degree, I just don't even really understand what that means. Again, I understand having criticisms of him as just a vocal actor in general and taking it for more talented voice actor roles. That I understand, and that I think is a discussion worth having. Again, I understand. Be critical of the film's tonal choices, story it chooses to tell, the constant pop culture references, lazy product placement, which there is quite an abundance of in this movie, robust pacing and cliches. I understand if while you're watching that, you can get frustrated with that and think and are right to believe that kids deserve better. But here's the thing. If your main complaint about the Garfield movie is that I, as a Garfield fan, did not have my feelings and wants for this movie validated, and it's a bastardization of the product that I have held so dearly, I just don't really understand or know what to tell you. I think the Garfield movie is completely innocently sweet. Is it a bit lazy at times? Is it a bit cliched? Is it some of the worst tendencies that we see in kids' films these days? Sure, but it's also a movie that I know make kids laugh in my theater. It's a movie that has a legitimately endearing story about fathers and sons. And as a son of a father, it got me a bit. So that's where I'm just like, the online chatter of this movie is where I'm confused. And I wouldn't even say it's the critical online chatter of this movie. Just normal, everyday people wasting their breath on the Garfield movie is where I'm just so confused on it. This movie is obviously made for kids. And again, you can have your complaints on how Hollywood makes movies for kids these days and the lack of emotional intelligence that they're willing to engage in with a children's movie, and how that is harmful and just disrespectful to children's movie and people who make art for children. I understand all of those, and those are fair topics to be discussed, but that's not what we're discussing here, quite literally. That is not the discourse surrounding the Garfield movie. As this movie exists, I've had a perfectly serviceable time seeing this movie, but as an experience in theaters, spending an hour and a half in it, it was fine. I legitimately do not regret watching this movie, and I found it endearingly sweet and better than I would have ever expected this movie to be. 2.5 out of 5 stars for the Garfield movie. Trust me, I know my frustration with the Garfield movie discourse is weird. Considering my last episode / review, I quite literally had a meltdown about a Netflix movie. So I get it that there are things that just like you see it and that just feels like the end of an industry you love. With that said, it's a little weird to me that the Garfield movie is triggering that so much out of legitimately grown adults.